Benjamin is going to officially get us started now that we have a good number of people here. Benjamin, you want to say a little something?
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. My name is Benjamin Ako. I'm a PhD student at Arizona State University, Chemical Engineering. And I'm excited to be part of this group because I just have so many rich minds here to learn from. But this is how it's going to work. If anyone, we just want to have a discussion ranging from any field. And so if you have a question, just indicate by raising your hands. We have the panelists here, and then I can call you out and then you ask your question. If you're comfortable typing it out, that's fine. If you want to unmute yourself, that's also fine. So we can go ahead and start. Anyone that wants to start. But the panelists are here. Maybe they should just introduce themselves again so that we know them in their own voice. Is that okay? All right, so you can start, Bethany.
Great. My name is Bethany Solleretter, and I'm a research fellow at the Laudato Si Research Institute here at Oxford University. We've been talking about C.S. Lewis, so I just wanted to mention that I'm about 20 feet from the Eagle and Child where he and Tolkien used to hang out. So I'm saying hello from a late hour in Oxford, but I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you.
And I'm Greg Kutsona. I am up in Northern California, in the North State in Chico, which is about 90 miles north of the capital, Sacramento. I teach at Chico State University in comparative religion and humanities, and my specialization is science and religion. I also co-direct with my colleague Drew Rick Miller, who's at the conference, a ministry called Science for the Church. So we bring scientific resources for the sake of spiritual growth in Christian congregations. And so I sort of split time to some degree between both of those. I think they're both about 3/4 time. So however that adds up, it's a good life, and I'm thankful for it. So that's how I come to this, and I'm sure other interests will come out as we talk today.
Owen?
Hi, I'm Kelly Burton, and I'm your host today. I just want to say, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat room, and we will try to field them so that if you don't feel confident just talking, we can get your questions answered through the chat box.
Yes.
And I'm Dr. Owen Anderson. I'm listed as a panelist, although I was originally a moderator, and I'm not sure exactly how those are distinct or what, but I think this will be a great opportunity for a conversation. I teach philosophy and religious studies at Arizona State University.
All right. Does anyone have any questions to start off with? Hi. Okay, go on, Richard. You can unmute yourself.
Yeah, so Bethany knows me, so she knows my background. I have degrees both in philosophy and in Old Testament Hebrew Bible. My question is, how do philosophers and theologians of science relate to what biblical scholars say about Christian faith? Is there a conversation that is going on, or are we really siloed? My interest is in integration of these things. Open to anyone.
Bethany, I'm always going to defer to you first. So,
Okay,
yeah,
great.
yeah.
So I think that there's less of a conversation than I would like to see. And partly that's just the way that universities are set up, you know, where seminars are often not integrated or departments are siloed. I think that there is a conversation, but I mean, in my book, I had several chapters on philosophy and theology, and I had one biblical studies chapter, and sort of the reviewers always said, like, this doesn't really fit. What is this doing here? and so I think that just sort of highlighted that we're not actually used to doing that. And part of that is that the sort of specialized tools that you need are very different. You know, Most people in sort of modern theology, for example, will not have spent enough time in the biblical languages to really be able to engage well with biblical scholars, and vice versa. So you end up in the position where you're acting as an amateur in somebody else's field, which is always a terrifying endeavor. And I think that we should jump into that and just be humble about it. Say, you know what, I've done my best. There will be mistakes here, but let's continue that conversation.
And I guess there's two hats that I'll put on to answer that question, Richard. It's a great question, and one that's really of deep interest to me. On the one hat is as co-chair of the Science, Technology, and Religion Program Unit of the AAR, the American Academy of Religion. And I would say we don't see a lot of conversation between specialists in the biblical texts and philosophy of religion, theology of science, et cetera. So in that sense, it's absolutely the experience that Bethany's talking about. We tend to be siloed so much. And I would say, without being incredibly like B.F. Skinner-ish, we're not really rewarded for doing interdisciplinary work. Our other colleagues don't write great blurbs for us or review us as well if we do interdisciplinary work. That's not something that we get rewarded for. So we tend to move away from it just out of a behavioralist approach. However, my other hat with Science for the Church, in Christian congregations, I think there is some really robust conversation, or there can be, about the biblical text, especially the Hebrew Bible texts, and questions of origins. I'm thinking here of John Walton and other people like him that I've encountered through BioLogos that are doing really important work to help us understand how to bring science and faith together, Christian faith together. One of the things that I've recognized, I've been doing work in Christian congregations as a pastor first, before as an academic, and doing work in Christian congregations. A lot of times when people try to bring together science with their faith, it's actually the biblical studies work that's the biggest problem. Like, if you bring science to a really unnuanced biblical hermeneutic, it's going to be difficult to get much that's positive out of the interaction. So I found, especially in the congregational work, that having some good biblical scholars was really, really important for making the interaction actually have traction and develop fruitful results. So, it depends on the context, I suppose, and the way I'd answer that question.
Richard, can I ask about your experience?
So you and I both were, right, appointed as theological fellows of BioLogos for this reason, right, at different times, like 4 or 5 years back. I started out in philosophy and theology, philosophical theology, and realized that for me, philosophy was the easiest subject to study. I found conceptual ideas with fear and trembling to that field and learn that. So that's what I did my doctorate in. So when I get invited to speak, sometimes they think I'm a biblical scholar, sometimes they think I'm a theologian or philosopher. They're never quite sure. It depends who asks me. So I keep bridging that gap in my own life, in my own teaching. I teach courses that are really integrative. They're not particularly biblical studies alone. They're not just theology alone. They have cultural studies, history of science, part of the thing. So I'm interested in just crossing the boundaries. And a place where I found that very helpful was BioLogos, where they're trying to do that. Does that match your experience at all? Because I mean, yeah, I love your stuff.
Yeah.
One of the things in my department, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, in my case, I generally don't know what to call myself at all.
Yeah.
One of the things we do in my department, it's in the integrative studies department. So we have philosophers, historians, social scientists, historians, English lit, and astronomers. And so we do have classes where you have team teaching by specialists in their field. So you could, although most of us have studied the other person's topics, but we haven't done so as an expert. And we're encouraged to kind of cross the disciplinary silos and ask questions with each other.
Okay, thank you. Any other question? There's a question in chat box.
Shall I read this question? What do you think is the most productive way for Christians in the sciences to engage with alternate, existing, and often unstated or assumed philosophies of science in the academy? Speaking as an engineer whose discipline is stereotypically known for not liking all the humanities stuff.
I wonder, Nathan, would you be willing to talk to us? Are you meaning the productive way for Christians to engage? Do you mean to learn more about alternate existing philosophies, or to sort of challenge in the workplace existing philosophies of, say, positivism that are there? I'm not sure I'm clear on the answers. Either type or feel free to unmute.
Thank you. I would say both, because first of all, I think a lot of Christians don't understand necessarily the underlying philosophies of science, or aren't willing to do the legwork of understanding them in sort of a cultural hermeneutic sense. But then also, how do we engage with things like, especially positivism, which is so entrenched in a lot of modern scientific academies, and people don't really have the philosophical interest to want to uncover that and look at other potentially more postmodern, for example, understandings of the philosophy of science.
Yeah. Greg, do you want to go first this time?
Well, I would say the side of this that actually is fascinating to me is how there's cultural elements embedded in the way we approach science and scientists approach their work. So a lot of time, I just wrote this book for Routledge called Negotiating Science and Religion in America. And I did a history of the United States from the Puritans to the present. And the reason I mention that is in doing that research, I realized how racist science is and has been, and how much racism is involved in science. So this is a topic I've been very, very convicted by. You know, like my alma mater, Berkeley, UC Berkeley, just removed Joseph LeConte from the anthropology building. I'm sorry, from the physical sciences building, or the LeConte brothers, and Kroeber from the anthropology building, because of the amount of racism that was in the way they approach science. So I would say that not only is there like the positivism issue, but within the philosophies that are often approached for science, to do science, there's a lot of cultural bias that can really distort the way the science is done. And I would love to see scientists more challenged. I mean, I'm seeing it happen, of course, but I think that's when I look at the, you know, you might say postmodern or contemporary views of the philosophy of science. I think there's more sensitivity to those issues of how do we actually bias the way that we do the scientific work that we do.
Great. When I first came to Oxford, I was, for various reasons, actually placed in the materials department at Oxford. So I was surrounded by all these theoretical and material physicists who, you know, I felt like Penny walking into the Big Bang, into Sheldon and Leonard's apartment with, you know, blackboards everywhere filled with equations that I could make no sense of. And so I thought, oh, this is so great. I was there for 3 years and I had all this time to talk to these scientists. And I realized that in talking to practicing scientists, their own understanding of the philosophy and the history of science was, generally speaking, just not there. It just wasn't a deep area of interest. They were really hyper-focused on the specific questions they were trying to answer. So, so they often had never spent time reflecting on why and how they were positioned in what they were doing. I think in terms of wanting to learn more, I'd just point to organizations like the American Scientific Affiliation, journals like Zygon, Theology and Science, Perspectives on Science and Christian Faith. I think there's a special issue of Zygon actually recently that was on sort of materialism and ontological naturalisms and that sort of thing. So there are lots of resources out there academically for that. But I think in terms of engaging colleagues, I've found that often the most productive way is just to ask questions. ask questions until people realize that there are interesting questions out there that they aren't aware of the answer of. And then often they'll think, well, what do you think? And that gives an entrance to put something forward. Whereas if you come in saying, why are you so limited? Why aren't you, it obviously doesn't go over well. So I try to ask more questions rather than do that. But you could also run lunchtime seminars. We sometimes did that over materials. There are lots of ways you can have open-ended discussions, even in state universities and that sort of thing about these questions.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. So any other question, anybody? I have a question that I want to address to the panel, especially Dr. Owen. I am from Nigeria, and we, in our high school, we are introduced to religious studies, even in middle school. So we know about theological concepts. So when we go to the university, we are introduced to philosophers and all those things. But it's different coming to the United States. I don't know about places like England, but it's different in the United States. When I was in my undergrad, I understood that there's a class I took in the human events that we did a lot of philosophical studies. And these students know these books, but they don't know anything about theological books. So as a Nigerian student, I was thinking, where is the bridge and where is the boundary? Such that when you marry both of them together, there is a bridge that connects them, and yet there is a boundary that you shouldn't step by. I just don't understand that complex. Can you help with that? You're muted, sir.
All right. That's a good question. I'm actually teaching right now, Introduction to Christianity. And so people ask me that question, how can a Sun Devil teach about Christianity? I guess you probably spend the whole time debunking it or something. No. It becomes, especially this, because what happens is at a secular university, the assumption is it becomes a kind of history class, or it becomes an anthropology class, right? I'm a philosopher, so I teach it as a philosophical and religious studies class. So I think the answer to where those overlap is in the overlap in the questions about the meaning of life and the purpose of doing things, what values we have. Those are religious, but they're not scientific or humanities. What's interesting, I think one of the bigger setbacks actually nowadays is not the divide between those subjects, but it's the lack of prior education, so that I spend time doing things in a college level class that I shouldn't have to spend time doing. My students don't know who Moses is. They know Jesus because that's a cuss word, but beyond that, they don't know much else. So I have to spend time on Adam, Cain and Abel, Abraham, Moses, and that seems like that's background. I mean, that's not just the Bible. They don't know who Hamlet is. I'll make a reference to Hamlet, and they don't know it. So I don't mean that by way of like being kind of a snobby academic, saying, "Oh, look at the declension here." Before we started, we were talking about dystopias. I don't mean that so much as it says something about sort of what are we doing before college? What kind of reference points do students have? So I find that to be the bigger challenge. I actually haven't got much pushback or challenge about the question of blurring theological and secular lines.
Okay, thank you. Any other person? Any contribution to that?
I teach at the community college down the street from Dr. Anderson, and I teach an intro to Christianity as well. And we were sort of discussing this week, that there's a lack of background information, even for Christian students. I think I have about 15 Christians in that class, and they didn't know there were 4 gospels. So I think there's just a lack of basic knowledge of not just Christianity, but all of the religions. I also teach world religions, and I find that people just don't have any background knowledge in this. So maybe we need to think about how that comes into education prior to college.
Yeah, but I think for your direct question, What do you think about that? Because I know the humane classes that you take in honors program probably do look at great works, and then they look at basic questions that we all ask that are addressed in those great works, and those really would cross all the lines of disciplines, right? I mean, a scientist wants to know what the meaning of life is just as well as a English lit major. Has some great what's Elon Musk up to now? He was talking yesterday about inventing some next thing, some great engineering. Talk about engineering as science, right? Some great applied engineering step for humans. I think it was about getting people off of. He has a goal for when we'll be off of fossil fuels, and you say, "Hey, great! So, like, what's the point of doing that? Well, so we'll have a cleaner environment. So what? So we can do what? We were mentioning Brave New World before we started. They have a clean environment in Brave New World. They've dealt with sickness. They've overcome old age. And they still end up meaningless, so then you need soma in order to make their life bearable. So the scientists have to still answer this so what question.
Yeah, it's just coming in on that, actually. I think that there are some really interesting questions that we're now being faced with in light of how successful our technologies are. So we can extend life to such an extent now that we now have forgotten how to die. You know.
Yeah, that's what's going on in the beginning of Brave New World.
Yeah, yeah. And so we're facing these questions, and there's not really a great cultural milieu to discuss them. I mean, I think things like The Good Place was a really interesting exploration of those kind of questions, particularly at the end of the third season. But I wonder how we will face that. And you know, I was speaking sort of before we started about the difficulties of possibly facing an irretrievably changed climate, and how can we respond to that, and what does it mean to respond to that as a Christian theologian, in light of the fact that death is, I believe, something both God put into the world, God created the world with, but which has through sin become an enemy to us in our experience of it. How do we marry those two things together? And how can we do that culturally in ways that affirm life, but also say we're still looking to a life beyond, a new creation?
Bethany, I'm interested, unless Kelly, you want to ask another question, but I'm interested in a question for you, Bethany. You talked about animal suffering, you know, in our pre-conversation and also in your video. And, you know, the conference is called Human Flourishing. That's the end of the conference title. We're talking about human flourishing. Is there a way in which human beings need to take care of the rest of creation, including animal life, for there to be human flourishing? Can human flourishing ever be pulled out as something that's, you know, at the expense of the animal world or the other animal world, or the expense of the environment? Or is it really an ecosystem in which we have to be thinking about these questions altogether?
Oh, yeah. I mean, we're totally dependent creatures in every single way on animals and other living life, right? We're not autotrophs. We can't derive what we need from the sun. Plants can do just fine without us. We cannot do fine without plants. And I think there's a part in Bill Bryson's A Short History of Nearly Everything where he sort of says, you know what? This is the bacteria's planet. They were here at the beginning. They will be here when the sun explodes. And we are only here because they allow us to be. And so I think that there can be an overwhelming anthropocentrism in how we approach that. And people generally point to one of two things. They point to the doctrine of the Incarnation. Well, God became human. God did not become, you know, an antelope, but also the image of God. And actually, both of those are really interesting and contested things. So, you know, John 1 doesn't say God became human, but God became flesh. God became sarks. And so there's been this notion of deep incarnation brought out by people like Neil Scregerson, which are saying, you know what? God didn't just become human. God became chordate. God became animal. God became oxygen and hydrogen. And in that way, just as Jesus didn't have to be a woman to represent me and for me to find integration into the meaning of the incarnation, so maybe Christ didn't have to become mammal for all mammals to be included in the salvific effects of that. Now, if that is true, then it expands our idea of what Christ came to save. And the doctrine of the incarnation is not uniquely important for humans in the way that we've tended to expect it to be. And I think that's really exciting because it allows us to think of our ethics differently, and it allows us to expand the scope of our theology in a way. So yeah, we do care for other animals, and we should care for other animals, but we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that they take much better care of us than we do of them.
Mm-hmm.
We are dependent on them, not the other way.
Okay, any other question or comment?
I would add something to what Bethany said, unless somebody else has a comment, because that was great. And there's two parts to the incarnational part, and then the science part. So one of the elements of having the power of science is that it does assert us as different from other animals. And so in a way, the very connection we're talking about in these kinds of conferences is really the essence of why we have a problem, I think, at some level. And I just find that always really worthwhile to take in when we consider what is the relationship between these different fields. But even more centrally, as a person who studies other religions and teaches other religions, the incarnation is really a tricky doctrine. You know what I mean? Like, Christianity would be so much easier if we didn't have the incarnation. And when you get deep incarnation, when you get the connection that puts the transcendent God into the universe, into it, right? I mean, I press this one pretty hard. It wasn't, like many people seem to want to do, make God's touch into this world as kind of quick and as quick and I don't know, God was able to evade that moment as quickly as possible. It's much deeper for me than that. And that makes this really complicated, but I think it leads to the kind of ethics that you were pointing out, that we are connected with the wider world. And as we bring in the sciences that we have been given as part of, I think, of a particular role as human beings, they need to serve, I think, that ethical vision that puts us within the framework of the entire creation.
So in your work with sort of local church, where do you find the pulse of the church, if I can ask that?
Yeah.
Where are people on these questions?
That's a really good question. It certainly varies from the kind of church there is, right? Like, I have a friend who I collaborated with a few years ago, who comes from a more liberal Protestant tradition. He said, we have no problem with science. We have problems with the Bible. You know what I mean? So that was his glib way of saying it was actually making the Bible relevant and interesting within a very scientific and technological world. So in that case, I think it's not getting over the question of, is evolutionary theory legitimate as a Christian or something like that? But, how do we understand what science teaches us and connecting it with, our life as human beings? So one of the things that we've found in Science for the Church actually is that human element is really powerful. Like, if we take, and I think this is an area of interest. So human sciences, psychology, sometimes evolution or evolutionary psychology, neuroscience, those things can really have resonance with people in the congregation. And certainly for a congregation that is more liberal leaning, that can be really interesting. As much as, well, here I'm tempted to paraphrase Jesus, who said, "The poor you will always have with you," which is a tremendous burden we need to take on as Christians. But I think evolution we will always have with us. You know what I mean? I've wanted to get beyond that question in working in churches at some level, not because it's unimportant, but because there are other interesting questions. But certainly in many congregations in the United States, the questions of origin, of course, the question of Adam and Eve has had a lot of traction in the past couple of years. I see that as something that is important. So for more conservative congregations, how do I read my Bible? The same Bible that's going to hold my marriage together, that's going to help me understand how to pray and trust it when there are things that seem to be challenged by scientific frameworks. And I think actually the Adam and Eve question really is, how do I know Jesus saved me? If there isn't this fall that has some historical rooting. So for some people, that's a really big question, but it really comes down to the existential or personal issue. It's not so much the theoretical issue. It's like, how does this affect my life? Can I actually be saved given what I hear? So what I'm trying to lay out there is I think there's in my experience with churches, of course, which is limited. Of course, it's not every church in the United States, but there's, I think, a range from the questions about origins on the more conservative side to the questions of how do we relate, how to make our faith relevant in a scientific world on the more liberal side.
Yeah, that's really, really helpful. I mean, I was really struck when I moved from first from Alberta in Canada, where I'm from, where things tend to be very conservative. So I always call it the Texas of Canada. And then I moved out to the left coast in Vancouver for a few years, and then moved on to England, where it turns out Christians can drink, amongst other things. But also, evolution just was not an issue. Evangelical traditions where I was expecting opposition when I sort of walked in the doors, they're all going, no, it's fine. It just doesn't have that same cultural, it's not a cultural boundary marker of what real Christian belief is. And so what I found really sort of refreshing is that there is room for other types of discussion that doesn't suck all the oxygen out of the room. And in the Church of England, where I'm a member here, one of the main concerns is really about climate change and how can we make our churches, carbon neutral over the next 15 years. And I think that's a really exciting goal to have. Yeah. Difficult when you're working with 1,000-year-old stone churches, but nonetheless, a really exciting goal.
That's a good line. I was going to add, I probably should have said this. There's obviously the incredibly relevant questions in the United States of recent events. So like COVID-19, in our newsletter, we do a lot of work with that kind of those questions, and race is a huge question. I mean, I think science can really help us understand race, psychological sciences in terms of like implicit bias, but also the nature of what is race. I'm going to go back to this historical study, the enduring legacy of eugenics and racism within the scientific enterprise in Western countries. So I think those are very relevant topics that, because of current events, people have traction with people, I think, in the pew.
Well, we have a few more minutes left. Perhaps we should wrap up our time together and thank our speakers, thank our panel. It's been really good to have all of the people here. Thank you all for joining this conversation. And I suppose we move on to the next part of the discussion, Benjamin.
Dr. Owen, is there any other part of the discussion that I don't know about?
No, I think this is it. We have a couple minutes if we have any more questions from the audience.
Yeah, because this is supposed to be it. So just 7 more minutes before this session ends. So if there's any other question or comments. Yeah.
Well, here's a question to see if we can have some discussion. We don't seem to be able to talk with each other. And what I mean by that is just thinking about some of the topics that were just brought up. if it's a relief to get to go to a place where they don't debate evolution, and someone else will say it's such a relief to go to somewhere where they do debate evolution or the environment or not. And in light of events right now, both in England and the United States, people are pretty badly divided. And it isn't just that they disagree, it's that they can't even talk to the people on the other side of division. What do we do? I mean, it seems like that's what science and religion have been like for quite some time as well. Conferences like this are meant to help bridge that. They may or may not do that. How can we? Is there applications from what we do in science and religion to that larger problem that we just can't talk to each other?
Actually, I will step in first on this one, Bethany, if that's okay, unless you want to go. I mean, this troubles me a great deal, honestly. So, Owen, it's a topic I think about all the time. And you may know that the polls in the United States show that in the last 10 to 15 years, evolution has become a political issue, a literal political issue. It skews away from Republicans now, like it didn't 15 years ago. And of course, back to climate change and et cetera, ecology. Richard Nixon in 1970 was the person who put in the Clean Water Act and all that sort of thing. So there was a concern about the environment among Republicans.
Teddy Roosevelt?
Well, Teddy Roosevelt, exactly. Yeah, totally. Yeah,
National
go back
parks.
further. Totally, right, absolutely. And you know that if you know, as we heard about the political debates that went on, not only in the presidency but other places, science was associated with the Democratic Party, so it sounds like a political issue in that sense. Having said that, I think in a congregation we actually have if we're in a Christian congregation or other kind of congregation, we have a certain amount of I believe we have the opportunity to do something different, which is to utilize the fact that we know one another to have good conversations. And I would leverage that. In fact, we have leveraged that in some of the work that we've done. So that if, again, in a sort of anti-evolution, if a church is an anti-evolution constituency, to bring in, you know, the biology teacher who also was the youth group leader, is the youth group leader, right? So you trust that person implicitly. There's a way in which that person is part of your tribe. You know, boundary pioneers is the word that Elaine Howard Eklund uses. My science teacher, when I was not a Christian yet in high school, my biology teacher said I'm a Christian and I subscribe to evolutionary science. You know, like that kind of person coming in who's trusted in congregations can be really, really powerful. I think there's also, you know, storytellers are really important, meaning people who talk about what science means as a scientist can break down some of those barriers. So, you know, you're not necessarily taking the level of ideas, which can create conflict, or even the level of, you know, is this a threatening way of describing the world? But you're saying, here's a person that's in my congregation. So I guess I would go for that angle. Like, I think the angle that divides us so often is when we see this person that has another idea as that idea threatens the community in which I find myself. And if I sound like I'm channeling Jonathan Haidt, I am, you know, and other people. Like, I think we actually argue to see, am I in a community that makes sense? So I think if we are in the community already and we make sure we recognize that, we can have productive conversations. As a person who's been a pastor, that is hard to do because a lot of pastors are very afraid of conflict. So you have to be able to step into conflict or disagreement and see it as a potentially positive thing, not to solve perhaps an issue, but to make sure the community has a deeper sense of intimacy because they're being more real with what they actually believe.
Yeah. Richard, do you want to come in?
On this subject, I got involved in the science faith discussion through the Colossian Forum in Grand Rapids, you know, and that's what they do. They bring people together. You first tell your testimony. This is how I came to faith, and this is how I think about the issue and what worries me and so on. It's very personal, and we worship together. It's only after that, and doing some reading together, that we start talking about the issues. And by that time, the other person is a real person with their own story, and you now start to trust them. You understand why they believe what they do. And it doesn't mean we will agree at the end, but there's a respect and a lack of fear in discussing these issues. I think that's really helpful.
In fact, the Colossian Forum is one of the models that we've used. We just did a newsletter interviewing Rob at the Colossian Forum to talk about those very things. So I totally agree. And I'll just put this in the chat room. We have a newsletter that has been looking at these issues in the past few weeks. So if you want to read a couple of those, just go to our website. So I'll put our website on. But it's something that was deeply concerning to me. But there are some really good models like the Colossian Forum and others, I think.
Yeah. I would totally agree with what's been said. And I was actually going to mention the Colossian Forum. So I'm so glad you did, Richard, because I think our inability to talk to each other comes from the fact that we have shattered identities. We have deeply fractured, unstable identities, and that has to do with breakdowns of families, breakdowns of extended communities, hypermobility, which means you're constantly moving, so you don't have deep attachment to place or to people. And that's going to be especially evident in universities where everyone is transient. So anybody who's spent lots of time in the university knows that it's one heartbreak after another as you make friends and they all move. And I think that our inability to talk to each other is evidence of, I don't know if people know about attachment style psychology, but if you have a secure identity, a secure attachment to the things around you, I think that enables you to talk and to be able to have these discussions without it attacking your core. But what we're seeing at, I think, an international level is anxious avoidant behavior around these topics that are close to the heart. And I don't know what the solution for that is, but I do think that it starts with trying to create deep community, deep places of anchoring in a world that is not built to allow that. And I think that that's why identity politics has become so important, is because people are saying, this is my identity, this is what I'm going to hold on to with everything. And unfortunately, the places where people have attached on to the bigger boat have become these really divisional places in terms of it's a political identity, or it's a nationalist identity rather than a human identity, or so I think there's good work for us to do as the church.
Andrew, go ahead.
Hi, I am a photographer. So I grew up in the church, and I also studied to become a doctor toward high school and college, and then I burned out, and then I eventually became a photographer. But the reason I decided to join this whole conference is because I like the intersection of faith, science, and photography. So as I got into photography, I kind of was, I was science minded. So I looked at the scientific principles of photography. And then as I'm, thinking about that, I'm also thinking about like my faith. And then all of a sudden over a year, it just overlapped and it clicked. And that became a key to unlocking a new way of understanding the Bible and understanding how God works. So when Bethany, you talk about identity, I really like that broken identity, because one of the things that I've thought about was, so I'm a photographer, and in Genesis, where it talks about, we were created in God's image. So that word sticks out to me as a photographer, image, right? So what is an image? An image is a moment in time captured. So if you look at, for example, my social media, you might see a picture of me relaxing on a beach. But if that's all you see of me, then you might think, oh, he likes the beach, he likes to relax or whatever. But that's not all of me. It's just a part of me, right? So I have, I'm happy, I'm sad, I'm angry, I'm excited, I'm calm. I'm a whole person, but that's just a sliver of who I am. And so when God created Adam in his image, that's just a sliver of who God is. And when he created Eve, that's a different sliver of who God is. So when he created every human being, all our DNA and whatnot, it's just a part of who God is, right? So when you put it all together, you get a bigger picture of who God is. And so, so the funny thing is, I thought about Adam. He took dirt, clay, and he molded it, and then he breathed life into it, and then he imprinted his image on it, right? And so he took this medium and he put his image on it, and I was like, that's the first selfie ever. So So anyway, I'm thinking about that, and like, through my own like quarter life crisis and whatnot, I was thinking about like, what is the point of life? Owen, you kind of touched upon that, and I think for me at this moment, it came to three things. The first thing is figuring out what your image is, right? What sliver of God are you? And then two, once you figure that out, it's practice it, get better at it. Take your gifts, take the things that you love doing, and practice it, because there's the raw talent, and then there's practice to make it even better. And then the third thing is helping other people with that. So loving on other people with your things that you are naturally good at, your sliver of God that you are, and helping other people. And so when the question of how do we communicate, I think the broken identity is absolutely a part of that. So when we help people find their identity, build them up, and then when you actually help other people, it makes you feel good, because like you feel useful, right? You feel purpose. And so I think that also comes with humility. When you have tribalism of different teams, it builds on like pride. But like when you have humility, then you can actually say, hey, what's your story? So I feel like that's kind of like me, as I like the intersection of faith, science, and photography. So I like how, I know the deep technical stuff about photography, and I know in whatever lane you might be in, you can go deep into that and become an expert. But my wife, she's not technical at all. She's more about the heart and the feeling. And so she reminds me a lot to also remember to step back and say, what's the point of all this?
Mhm.
And I think when you have that kind of perspective, it helps you like, realign with the rest of the world.
Mhm.
So anyway, I just want to thank you guys for putting this on.
Thank you, Andrew. I think we're out of time. There's one other question from Nathan in the chat box. I'll just read it. You can think about it and see if it's something we can answer quickly, or if it's something maybe we have to take offline. He says, I'm curious to hear what tips the speakers would have for us developing theological understandings of our disciplines in general, especially for those of us without advanced theological training. Okay, I have a suggestion. I think there are a lot of people in this group that you can chat with through the Whova, and I would say connect with people. If you're local in Arizona, connect with Dr. Anderson, connect with me. We try to do public philosophy. I know there's a lecture series going on at ASU West campus that we try to have these kinds of difficult conversations locally. Otherwise, you can email us. We're getting some email addresses in the chat box, but I'm pretty sure we're over time. So I'm going to say thank you, everyone. It's been great. Let's say this is the beginning of a conversation.
I like that.
Yeah, thank you so
Thank you.
much. Thank you, Benjamin and Kelly and Owen, Greg. Thank you.
Thank you, Bethany. Thank you, Greg. And thank you, Benjamin. It's good to meet you.